It's time for the ornament. I was thinking this year I would make a sphere with a snowflake pattern. And I would make it out of walnut and maple to get a good contrast. And it would just kind of be a wintry theme. So I got a piece of walnut ready, which is from the tree that I cut up with my friend Gabe. And it's the other half of the piece that I used to make the bowl for him. It's funny when you mill lumber, you see a great big slab and you think there's so much wood there. But by the time you cut it down and clean it up and get it ready, what's actually left is quite a bit smaller than what you thought you had. Now for making this pattern, it's going to be a lot of cutting strips and then gluing those strips back together and then recutting and regluing and recutting and regluing over and over and over again. So first I'll get my big piece of walnut and my piece of maple cut into strips that are close to what I'll need for making the pattern. So now I'm working on the maple. These will be the smaller pieces to the snowflake pattern. So what I'm going to do to start making this pattern is to first glue a piece of walnut and a piece of maple together. I'll cut the angle of the smallest branches of the snowflake into the walnut. Then I'll glue a strip of maple to that angle that I cut. So here I'm cutting the central piece, I think, in the pattern. And I'm cutting the maple. So now I will glue the walnut and the maple together. Now I was also making 4 strips of each of these pieces, so I would have enough material to make the sphere. I also miscalculated in my mind a little bit. I wanted to make a 6-inch sphere, and I kept thinking I was going to need 6 inches on each side to make the 2 halves. But I really only needed 3 inches, so I made twice as much of the segmented pattern material as I needed. But that's okay because I can use that pattern for something else now. Now I think this is the smaller section, or the smaller branch of the snowflake. So now that the 2 pieces are glued together, I can cut off most of the maple, which will leave me a little sliver of maple to make the branch on the snowflake pattern. So I can clean up the short side first, and that'll give me a surface to cut the longer side of the maple. And on a lot of these I jointed the surface before I re-glued them back together again. Now this is the bigger branch, and I can cut off the maple that I don't need. So now the 3 pieces of the pattern can go together, and this will make the 2 small branches of the snowflake pattern. So we'll glue those 3 pieces together. So I made 3 of these at this length, then I made 2 more that are about half the length, trying to work with the pieces of wood that I had. This project used a ridiculous amount of wood for the size of the sphere that I ended up with. I could have built a small bookcase with the wood that I used on this little sphere. And after each glue up, I'd scrape the glue off and get that surface ready for the next step. Now this surface needs to be rejointed, and I'll glue the main branch of maple onto this surface. Now I'll cut I guess it's the bottom, but it'll be the outside of the sphere. And this will be the bottom of the segment that I'll base the 2 15-degree angles for the segment on. in as many places as I could. When I cut the angle, I tried to use the piece that got cut off as the piece for another glue up. So it meant a little bit of planning and a little bit of leaving pieces big so I'd have enough extra to use. So this is gluing another one of the final glue ups together, but with a strip that has an angle to it. So I had to make some little angled blocks to help clamp that piece. Now I can work on the main maple branch of the snowflake. And I resawed this piece with a 6-degree angle in it. And I can use each half as the main branch in the pattern. I also ripped a 2x4 with that angle, which would help in clamping this piece on. So we can glue and clamp those together. So once I have this together, I'll have everything I need for the pattern. So now I need to cut off quite a bit of this strip. Now I'm using that angle that I cut earlier into that third piece of the pattern. And I left it a little thick, and then I jointed it down to exactly where I wanted it. Then I cut the other side. Now the blade is tilted to 15 degrees, and I just flipped the piece around. So it should be symmetrical over the angle on the bottom. These were a little tricky cutting this much height. So once I have this section made, I can then cut the segments from this section. Now I tried to get as close to 30 degrees as I could, but I knew it wasn't going to be perfect. And it was off a little bit. You can see the play in the ring here. One of the thoughts I had with the pattern was that I could use the thickness of the maple to sand off a little bit on each segment to get them to fit perfectly in the ring. So I'd put them on the disc sander and push just a little bit more on the nose and a little bit less on the back and reshape that angle. Going around the ring a few times, I got it to be perfectly tight. And doing it this way got all of the points to fill the center perfectly. So I didn't have to do a center plug. Now I just glue all these together. Now I made 2 of these, one for each side. On the first ring, I put glue on 2 sides of every other segment, trying that method. And on the second one, I put glue on 1 side of every segment. And it was about the same as far as time and speed of putting it together. Get it flat. Now I'm going to have to hold these on the lathe. So I made a little square block that I can glue to the side of the glued up ring. And this will give me something to put in the chuck, so I can hold on to this on the lathe. And I flattened up one side of the glue up. Then I just had to get my square fairly centered. And kind of looking at the defects in the wood, I chose which side would be the outside and which side would be the inside. So the squares will go on the outside of the sphere. It was a little tricky at this point because the square kept wanting to slide around on the surface. Once I held it for just a little bit, it was fine. So now they're ready to go on the lathe. So what I'm going to do is hold the ring in the chuck and make the square that I glued on a little more round. And this will help center that square. I don't want to make it too small, as the chuck then won't be able to hold the piece that I glued on. Now I want to take out a 4-inch diameter sphere from the middle. So I measured 2 inches of radius. Then I drilled a hole 2 inches deep into the center. And this will give me a gauge to know when I'm deep enough into the sphere. Now I can start hollowing out the inside. Now the plan had been to do a box and to make the 2 halves come apart. But I wasn't sure how I was going to turn a sphere with the 2 halves that weren't put together. So I think at some future time I will turn a box and I will figure out how to make that work, but I didn't want to do that on a pattern that I'd spent a week making. So I'm just going to glue these two halves together and just make a sphere. So doing the inside is to just make it a little lighter. I cut a little circle as a gauge too, so that I could be close to a hemisphere on the inside. And I can flatten the two faces. I can get the two faces flat on the lathe, but I can make them perfectly planar on the disc sander. So the seam will go together perfectly. And I want to make sure my pattern lines up right. So I mark the outside. I can't see the pattern on the inside when it's closed. And then I can just clamp this together. I ended up putting the clamps on the outer ring. This seemed to make more sense, as that's where the glue is. Then that's all dried up, and I can make my sphere. So I can make it a cylinder, and I can start cutting away the two sides. And the pattern starts to show itself. I knew the straight lines of the snowflake were going to wrap themselves around the curve of the sphere, but I didn't realize quite what it was going to do, and that it was going to actually turn out really interesting. So one of the things that it did is that the arms of the snowflakes started to make oval frames in the pattern. And I think it'd be neat to make the top and bottom a little shorter and then put a ring in the middle and put something on the ring, some kind of pattern or little pictures or something, so that you have the oval frames of the top and the bottom framing something in that central ring for some future project. So I've got it pretty close at this point, and I can take it off and cut off the extra bits. Now to hold the sphere on the lathe, I can use a cup on both the drive side and the tailstock. And I found I pretty much always have to clean up the cup on the drive side because it really has to run perfectly true. This is what'll make the sphere be a sphere. If it wobbles in that cup, this whole thing just won't work. And I found it gets easier and easier as you get closer and closer to a sphere. Right on the first pass, it's difficult because it doesn't really want to seat itself in that cup. But as the sphere becomes more and more spherical, it sits in that cup better, and the sphere doesn't vibrate as much, and it turns better, and you can get a better and better surface. So it's really just a matter of turning and then rotating and turning and rotating and just doing that over and over and over again, slowly getting closer and closer to a sphere. And I've said it before on other sphere videos, and I'll say it again, that the most important thing at this point is to only cut off about half of the height of the bumps. If you turn all the way to where you have a complete circle on each pass, then you'll chase your sphere all the way down to nothing. And in fact, on this, I think I was almost being a little too conservative on my cuts, and it was taking longer to get round than I thought it should be. But it did finally get there. You can hear at the beginning it's definitely rougher, and then towards the end the turning is a lot smoother, and there's much less being removed. I've gotten much better with the bowl gouge too over the last year or two, to where I don't even need to use the scraper towards the end of this, and I can go from the bowl gouge to sanding, and even the sanding isn't too bad. So I can sand now. I think I started at 80 grit and went up to 600. I think I did up to 400 with the sander, and then I did 600 by hand. And I do the same thing with sanding, where I'll sand and then I'll rotate it 90 degrees and sand and rotate and sand and rotate. And to do the 600, I just got 2 pieces of 600 sandpaper and just move the sphere in my hands. Then it's time for finish. And it's always the same thing where it looks pretty good without finish. And it's like, oh, should I really put finish on? And then I put finish on. It's like, oh yeah, that's why you put finish on. It makes it look so much better. The finish just helps the color and the grain just come out.
Merry Christmas.
I didn't say.
Thanks for watching.